Mindfulness and cognitive restructuring go together like chutney and cheese. In CBT, mindfulness is usually used in conjunction with cognitive restructuring to the point that they are inseparable. Using mindfulness meditation and mindfulness in waking life is going to help you learn to step back from your emotions, and over time, you'll find that you become calmer, more focused, and happier. But it can be used for so much more once you recognize the power this tool has for bringing about change. The point is, once you identify negative thoughts that are negatively affecting your life, you can change them. And that's where cognitive restructuring comes in. But first, a little more on CBT. CBT today is the most popular option for treating mental illnesses among major health organizations. The approach was introduced relatively recently and is a natural extension of another school of psychology that reigned previously, around the 1950s. And that school was behaviorism, and it was entirely defined by the notion of conditioning and association. The idea was that if you experience two stimulus at the same time often enough, they would eventually become links in your mind. Today, we know this is true. In neuroplasticity, neurons that fire together wire together. This means that if two neurons fire at the same time often enough, they eventually grow a very strong connection which might cause the other to fire involuntarily. This was demonstrated famously by Ivan Pavlov, who experimented on dogs. He rang a bell whenever he fed the canine participants, and over time, this created an association via positive reinforcement. Ultimately, this led to the dogs salivating whenever the bell was rung. As far as their brains were concerned, bell equals food. The same idea was then applied to human psychology. The hypothesis was that we could learn phobias, for example, by associating negative experiences with harmless objects. Likewise, it was theorized that you could treat a phobia via reassociation. If you classically condition someone to associate that stimulus with positive things again, they eventually lose the phobia. And this method proves successful in various studies. Behaviorism went a little too far, though, in that it claimed that every aspect of human experience was learned this way. We learned how to gesture because when we reached for things as babies, people passed them to us. We learned to walk because we kept falling over when we did it wrong, etc. Everything we did then was believed to be entirely motivated by the reward centers of our brain, which in turn helped us form new associations and develop new behaviors. The things we didn't learn ourselves directly, we might learn vicariously through social conditioning, from watching others, for example. For years, this idea reigned supreme, but eventually it started to lose favor as it was unable to explain every aspect of our psychology. Ultimately, it became apparent that there must be an additional internal element, and this is where the cognitive bit comes in. Cognitive behavioral therapy takes behaviorism and applies the idea that you can also reinforce experiences, both positive and negative, by thinking about them. For instance, you can learn to be afraid of heights even if you've never fallen from a height. How? By constantly thinking about how bad it might be to fall from a height. In other words, if you keep imagining that falling must be dangerous and you tell yourself things like, those railings don't look safe, then you can cause yourself to be afraid. What's more is that each time you think something like this and then stay away from the height as a result, you're essentially reinforcing that belief as though you'd fallen. So the idea behind CBT is to use the principles of behaviorism, but to combine these with the cognitive aspect. This means not only using elements like reassociation, but also thinking cures. So, one example of this is to use mindfulness meditation. Simply by choosing not to let your thoughts and emotions affect you, you can become less controlled by them and thereby less susceptible to your own fears and ruminations. But there are many more aspects to this too, and these tend to fall under the heading of cognitive restructuring, or in other words, changing your thoughts. One example is something called thought challenging. Here, you simply break down one of your thoughts or beliefs and thereby assess how accurate it is. For instance, you might find that you're afraid of talking publicly because you think people will laugh at you if you stutter. This is a debilitating belief that is ironically making you much more likely to stutter. So, what you need to do in order to overcome this is to look at the thought and ask, is this realistic? What you'll find is that 90% of the time, that belief is unlikely and unfounded. Most people would not be harsh enough to laugh at you if you stuttered, and even if they did, it wouldn't matter because you wouldn't see them again. Perhaps you might feel lame or like a loser if you stutter and people laugh. Again, you should assess that. Being able to confidently talk however it comes out and not to care about the outcome is actually a sign that you're very confident and aloof. Now, I used this technique myself when I had a phobia, and sorry, ladies, but this is definitely a guy thing. Um, I used to have a rather embarrassing phobia of peeing in public urinals. My fear was that if I couldn't go, then people would look at me and think I was strange for hanging out there and not really weeing. They think I was, a bit of a pervo or something. Anyway, I realized that most of the time that I was in this situation, I was in the pub. In other words, most of the other people in the toilets were probably drunk and oblivious to what I was doing. Meanwhile, why did it matter what they thought anyway? Let them think that. Eventually, this helped me to completely overcome the phobia, and now I have no problem at all with it. Another example is one that marries the ideas from CBT with more traditional notions from behaviorism. And this one is called hypothesis testing. Essentially, it means that you're testing your theory to work out whether or not it really holds up. So, if you're afraid people will laugh if you stutter during public speaking, that means you need to purposefully stutter on stage and let everyone see it. This will then, in turn, show you what happens in that scenario. And what you'll likely discover is that nothing happens. People are kind and they just wait for you to finish and then start again. Again, I used this in the real world, except I actually had no say in it this time. I was learning to drive here in the UK, where we drive on the left, and a manual transmission or a stick shift, as it's often called, is the norm, and you've got to learn how to work the clutch. And I kept stalling whenever the lights turned green and I was at the front. Of course, this happened due to nerves. I was worried that if I didn't leave quick off the mark, then the traffic behind me would get angry and it would be totally embarrassing. So, my driving instructor, being something of a renegade, decided to slam on the handbrake and tell me that we were going to sit there for the entire time that the light was green. Traffic behind me honked their horns, people shouted, but nothing happened. And then I started just fine the next time it turned green, and I've started just fine every time since.